It's Wednesday, the 11th of January, and this is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Tim Lawton, Labour MP Emma Lewell-Buck, Jack Blanchard of Politico and The Spectator's Isabel Hardman. And just a warning, there are flashing images coming up. On the programme today.
Health systems across Europe and across the UK have been under massive pressure from COVID and flu.
Ambulance crews strike in England and Wales today. But is the NHS in permanent crisis?
Johnson, you're a disgrace!
A less than warm welcome in London last night, but did Tory MPs make a mistake when they got rid of Boris Johnson? And could he make a return? 11 days into the year and Rishi Sunak is still in number 10. He'll face Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions at noon.
It's a lie, and hopefully now that the book is out, people will be able to see the context. And it's really troubling and very disturbing that they can get away with it.
And more attacks on the press from Prince Harry. This Sussex MP says he's not fit to be the Duke of Sussex. Hello, let's start with this headline in The Times. 1,000 excess deaths each week as the NHS buckles. Excluding pandemic, figures are worst since 1951. And today, of course, with ambulance strikes in England and Wales, it's not a good day to be ill. But my question to open the programme to the guests is, with 50,000 excess deaths last year, is any day a good day to be ill in this country at the moment? Tim?
Well, the pandemic had consequences, and one of the consequences of the pandemic was that the National Health Service was absolutely stretched, working flat out to help people with COVID and to avoid getting COVID and to vaccinate people against getting COVID, and they performed enormously well. But of course, the waiting lists for people to get treatment for routine things lengthened. People didn't present, either because they thought they didn't want to put further pressure on the health service to their doctors when they were worried about various symptoms, or they didn't get their treatment or analysis early enough. And we are now seeing the consequences of that. If you go back a year or so, the figures for seasonal deaths were actually lower than average as well. So I think we need to take the longer-term view on this, but there is no doubt that there will be further consequences on people's health and ultimately fatalities from the pandemic beyond just the deaths from COVID itself.
Tim's very clear that he sees the pandemic as probably the most overriding cause of the issues now that people are facing. But in your mind, Emma, is any day at the moment a good day to be ill in this country?
No, and it hasn't been for a long time. I don't think you can just blame this on the pandemic. Our NHS has been systematically being dismantled by the Tories for the last 13 years. Week after week, they're pushing through little bits of legislation or they're saying things to demoralise the workforce. This has been long-term decline in our NHS. You can't just keep blaming it on COVID. Workers are now out on strike out of absolute desperation because the government will not listen to them about the state of our NHS. You've got ambulance workers saying that they are seeing people die on non-strike days. How on earth did it get to this?
Any day a good day to be ill at the moment?
No, certainly not. And I'm sure anyone with elderly parents is hoping they're staying at home today. And that's a terrible, state of affairs for the country. And I do have some sympathy with the government. It's obviously true that COVID has a huge impact on health services, not just here, but all around the world. And you would expect that to be true. But I do think that the strikes and the stories that we're hearing out of the health service at the moment just add to this picture of a country that is just not working very well. And it just seems to me that if you're a government that wants to get re-elected next year, that is just a terrible look. And however much you might want to blame external factors, in the end, I don't think people are going to vote for a government when they feel like basic functions of the country are no longer happening. It'd
be interesting to see if that's what Keir Starmer goes on at midday at PMQs. But Isabel, yes, you were nodding away as Jack was talking.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real political problem for the government here, which is that it's very difficult to tell the difference between a strike and a non-strike day. now. And I think the famous Nye Bevan phrase, in place of fear, I don't think we can say the NHS exists in place of fear anymore. I think people are genuinely quite worried about what happens if they get ill, if they need an ambulance, will it turn up? And that's not to do with the strikes, that's to do with the state of the NHS. And just to take issue with I could take issue with points that both of you made on the NHS, with what Tim said about the pandemic. I mean, waiting lists were going up dramatically before the pandemic, as were, the NHS's ability to meet targets had already collapsed several years before the pandemic. So I think it's wrong to say that the pandemic caused this. It definitely made things a great deal worse. And I think that, I'm not sure the Conservatives have been actively dismantling the health service, but they certainly haven't been listening to the warnings of of those who actually understand the NHS in terms of workforce, in terms of social care, which they've had a long time to reform social care, and they've produced a hell of a lot of excuses about why they haven't
would you
done
accept a lot of that?
I don't disagree with Isabel. A lot of it's down to COVID, but it's certainly we had some serious problems before COVID. It's not down to dismantling the NHS. Record amounts of money have gone into the NHS. The spend as proportion of GDP, we're now up to, I think, 10.5%, which is about the EU average. So actually, we've been increasing the proportionate spend against other countries.
But that was after quite a few years, wasn't it? Particularly during the coalition years, where in fact the rate of increase was far lower than it had been.
We are at a much higher rate of our economy being spent on healthcare than we were under the Labour government. That's a fact. So it's not starving the NHS. We have a very serious problem with social care.
Under Labour government.
We have a very serious problem with social care, and I think you could say that governments over many years, and certainly for the last 12 years, should have grasped that nettle sooner. It is crazy. In my hospital in Worthing, last time I was there just before Christmas, something like 17% of the beds were occupied by people medically fit to be discharged, but the care wasn't there. And that's a complete waste of money. So putting ridiculous pressures on the hospital system. And that's what the government is now absolutely focusing on. And we absolutely need to do that. It should have happened earlier. That will take a lot of pressure off. It's going to take some time to filter through.
Just before we move on, and we will come back to the issue of the NHS, the rate of excess deaths and the ambulance strikes later on in the programme after Prime Minister's questions. I just want to bring you this news, which is that the Conservative MP, Andrew Bridgen, has had the whip removed. This is an announcement by the Chief Whip, Simon Hart. Andrew Bridgen has crossed a line, he says, causing great offence in the process. As a nation, we should be very proud of what has been achieved through the vaccine programme. This is in response to comments made by Andrew Bridgen's scepticism about the vaccine programme. The vaccine is the best defence against COVID that we have. Misinformation about the vaccine causes harm and costs lives. I am therefore removing the whip from Andrew Bridgen with immediate effect, pending a formal investigation. Let's talk about Boris Johnson. Show you this headline in the Daily Mail. Nadine Dorries, former Culture Secretary under Boris Johnson. Without Boris, she says, the Tories will die. It should be no surprise the one thing the Labour Party fears most is the return of Johnson. Let's talk to the chairman of the recently formed Conservative Democratic Organisation, David Campbell-Bannerman. He's also a former MEP. Is Nadine Dorries right, David?
I think she's got a strong point, actually, Joe, absolutely. I mean, Boris is still a great winner, and I think the polls are looking disastrous at the moment. So if the polls don't change, and I think the local election results are very bad, then you can't rule it out. You can't rule out the return of Johnson.
Right, you raising your eyes there, Tim.
We can rule out the return of Boris Johnson. Boris had to leave office for a reason. Those reasons have not gone away. We now have a Prime Minister who is going to be there at the next election. I have absolutely no doubt about that. He's getting on with the job. He's smart, he's professional, he's a grown-up, and we've got some stability back again. And the last thing we need is speculation about whether Boris is coming back again. He's not. Let's move on.
David, time to move on.
No, I think Tim is wrong, actually. Look at the polls, Tim. Will you hold on to your seat? I mean, this is a complete disaster. It's worse than 97. It was getting rid of Boris that's triggered it. We were only 2 or 4% behind in the polls when Boris was there. But we're not just about Boris, by the way. The CDO is about democracy and letting the party members choose. And they've been terribly treated and overlooked. And we need to re-engage with the members. I hope you can agree with that, Tim.
Absolutely. And I place great store by including my local members as much as possible in the decision-making. I think we've got to look again at the leadership process. The problem was, I'm afraid, that the MPs voted by a large margin for Rishi Sunak in the first contest that we had.
And
we then put it to the members, and they have the final say on the final two. Those were the reforms that came in under William Hague. And for whatever reasons, they went for Liz Truss, and we all know how that ended. That caused a big problem between the parliamentary party and the country as a whole. I think we've got to look at it again as to how we can make sure we've got a leader that has the confidence both of the parliamentarians, who he or she will lead directly and be in the news every day, and those people who do all the hard work, deliver the leaflets, raise the money behind the scenes as well. And at the moment, that's just not working. So democracy, yes, but that does mean revisiting the leadership process, I think.
David, do you agree, since the members did elect Liz Truss, and as Tim said, it didn't end well?
Well, they shouldn't. We shouldn't have been in that position. If we'd not got rid of Boris, we wouldn't have been in the position of having all these different leaders and leadership elections. So, again, it goes back to the same problem. But we are where we are, and we have to be realistic about that. I don't want to see the Conservative Party devastated at the next election. Now, Rishi can do some things that would help, obviously, and he is doing some things that will help. But, you know, we do need to readdress the democracy issue. A lot of associations around the country, Conservative associations, are in terrible trouble. They're tiny. It's withering on the vine. We went from 500,000 members in '98 when the new constitution was brought in to 172,000 now. I mean, we've got to address the real problems with the party and the lack of democracy within it.
All right, I'm going to show you some pictures because Boris Johnson attended a sellout private members club event. There are some flashing images. It was last night, and a Conservative Home survey shows he's more popular with the membership than the current Prime Minister. Tim, just to remind viewers, I think you were one of the first MPs to call for Boris Johnson to go. Did you get it wrong?
No. I'm, alas, and I mean, I've never quite understood Boris. I mean, he has this extraordinary ability to engage and connect with people who are from a completely different background, completely different perspective. And I see that in my constituency. So, and he did some fantastic things, certainly in Ukraine and vaccine and whatever. But you cannot have a Prime Minister who, I'm afraid, does not uphold the law and has been misleading in the whole process about Partygate and everything else that came with it. It wasn't the actual who was eating what piece of cake and necking Prosecco at whatever party. It was the fact that the story constantly kept changing. And I'm afraid his position became untenable and incredible. And I was getting, I'm afraid, an awful lot of my constituents saying, I've always voted Conservative. I cannot vote Conservative if Boris is still the leader at the next election. And that's why, with great regret and tragically, Boris's position became untenable. And that's why he had to go.
David, do you want to just respond to that, and then I'll open it up to the other guests?
Look what you've done, Tim. We're now 30% behind in the polls. We were 2 or 4% when Boris was there. What a great triumph. Thank you very much.
And where would we be if Boris was still the leader?
It's been a disaster. Why don't you listen to the membership, and why don't you listen to the public? Because they want him. They recognise his qualities.
Well, they don't.
You don't.
Right.
They don't. So I had a call, several calls with all my members, all my councillors, and with 2 exceptions out of all my members, including those who have been huge supporters of Boris all along, they said it's not tenable,
Well, please,
he has to go.
So
I listened to my members.
Share the minutes with us, Tim. It'd be great to have a look at that in detail. And we've got people on the ground there that we could actually verify that with. It'd be very interesting to hear more about that.
Come to my constituency and I'll arrange a meeting with my members.
Thank you.
Well, there's an
That'd be great.
invitation. I look forward to both of you reporting back after, David, you've read the minutes, and Tim, you've invited him to the constituency. Jack, what do you make of this argument? Who's going to win?
I'd be very amazed if Boris Johnson came back again. I think you talk about the Labour Party, the one thing they would love is to give the Tory members more say over who was Tory leader, given the absolute frolics they made of it last time. This is just his problem, wasn't it? She didn't have the support of MPs, is that she wasn't remotely up to the job, and everyone could see that straight away. Boris Johnson remains very popular with Tory members. He does not remain massively popular in the country, however, and lots of polling and focus groups show that. And I think really the reason why he ended up getting thrown out as Prime Minister was you know, Tim makes a very moral case of it, but the truth is there was a lot of Tory MPs looking at their own seats and looking at the Prime Minister and thinking he wasn't going to lead them to victory. And that magic touch that he used to have has been obliterated by his handling of the Partygate scandal, and I suspect is never coming back.
Isabel, do you agree? Is he never coming back?
Well, yes, but I've decided that in order to achieve a state of peace with reality, I have just accepted that I will die with two things still being unresolved. Whether Boris Johnson is going to come back at some point. I mean, I think genuinely we will be...
You're young, Isabel.
We will be asking... I mean, you know, we will have people paying visits to his gravestone and asking mediums after he's gone whether he's going to come back as Prime Minister, and also that social care is not going to be reformed. So,
yes, a very serious issue, of course, on the other side.
Something he promised he would do on his first day.
Oven ready.
Weirdly, that was not ready.
Still in the deep
Well, let me just show you the front page of the Mirror, which has exclusive shameless ex-PM Johnson living in £20 million home for free, courtesy of a Conservative donor. Is that really acceptable, David?
I haven't seen the story or the details, really. I don't know all the ins and outs of it. Well, he's just a Conservative MP now, so he needs to be judged on that basis, I think. But as I say, I haven't seen the details of it. But I do share Isabel's interest in this story going on and on. Boris is quite a showman, and I wouldn't rule him out coming back, actually. You know, who knows in politics?
Right, I'm not sure she was interested, but I think she thought that it might go on. I mean, a spokesman for Boris Johnson says all of Boris Johnson's interests, including accommodation, are properly registered and published in the Register of Members' Interests. David's right, he is now a Conservative MP. Like you. Is that the sort
Not
of
like
thing?
me, no.
No, well, no, but he is a Conservative MP. Not like you in personality. Is it right to accept those sorts of donations?
That's for Boris to justify. I haven't seen the story. I find little good ever comes of reading the Mirror. Anyway, that's a question for Boris.
All right. David Campbell-Bannerman, thank you very much. Let's turn to Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. He was talking on the programme, Ridge, on Sunday. Let's just have a listen, because he was being asked about his leadership pledge to defend freedom of movement as the UK was leaving the EU.
Defend free movement as we leave the EU. Right, we've left. No, so now we've got to face the future we're in. We're out of the EU, free movement has gone. So the question then comes, well, what do you want now? Do you want to go back, or do you want to have a different system with fair rules, etc.?
This is as we leave the EU.
No,
but this is acknowledging that we're leaving the EU and saying that you'll be defending free movement as we leave.
But we've left. We've left. And therefore, free movement was part of the package for being a member of the EU, inevitably. We've left. Free movement has come to an end.
Was that convincing, Emma, Keir Starmer's defence of why he's no longer defending freedom of movement on his leadership pledges?
I mean, he said what he said, and, you know, he stands by what he said. I mean, it's no secret that I'm the only Labour MP who walked through the lobby and voted for the Brexit deal. So, you know, I'm on a different page altogether on this anyway. But, you know, I think Keir's original 10 pledges, he still stands by those principles. Of course, the policies will change. The policies will always change, because there's been a lot of change since April 2020. We're on for our third Prime Minister now. The country and the world is a very different place to what it was when Keir laid out those 10 policies. But the principles behind them remain the same, as you've seen in the speech he did last week.
Right, well, except you say that he sticks to those principles. We haven't got all 10 pledges, but let's just give you a few in terms of whether or not voters can trust what Keir Starmer said. No private outsourcing to help the NHS. Now, there is an advocating by the Labour Party to involve more private sector companies in terms of helping the NHS. There's now no common ownership of water and energy bills, which he said there would be. Income tax increase for top 5% of earners. Now we know in December no taxes will be increased on the squeezed middle, as the Labour spokespeople put it. Not abolishing universal credit, which was another pledge. And as we've just seen there, free movement of people. That has also been junked. So when you say he's sticking to the pledges that he made during the leadership contest, that's not true.
I was saying he's sticking to the principles behind them. The principles and the actual policies are very different. If you look at the speech that he made last week and you look at those 10 policies, the principle behind it remains the same.
But which principle, though, Emma?
It's
because he was advocating common ownership, now he's not.
People being treated fairly, feeling secure, having good public services, and having politicians that are invested in public service and not self-service. They're all Labour values, and they're threaded through everything that he's done. Of course, policies will change. Nothing should stay the same as it was a few years ago. Things will always change as the country and as the world changes.
Are you disappointed by any of those pledges being dropped?
I don't think they've necessarily been dropped as such. I really don't. I think if you look at the announcements that we're making, they're broadly in line with those pledges.
Well, he promised to abolish universal credit, and now Labour will not abolish universal credit, rightly or wrongly, but they won't abolish universal credit. He said that there would be income tax increases on the top 5% of earners. Now, there aren't going to be. Well, as we sit here today, it might change before the election. Can you see why some on the left of your party are disappointed?
Well, I can, but I don't agree with that, because ultimately I wouldn't want a leader who was stuck 3 years ago. The next election's going to be 2024. We need policies going forward for the future, not for the past.
Do you agree that this is pragmatic politics? Of course things change. We've had a pandemic. We've had various changes of Prime Minister, and there are crises in sectors like the NHS.
I mean, I think it's pragmatic from Keir Starmer's point of view, but that's probably about as far as I say it. No, I think this was someone who was prepared to say whatever he needed to say to the left of his party so that he could get elected. And I think what's really interesting about it is just how ruthlessly he's been prepared to completely ignore all the promises that he made to them once ensconced in power, basically making the political calculation that most people in the country won't care what he said to a relatively marginal group of people, but ones that he needed to get into this position of power. And I think it does raise legitimate questions about how far you can believe what Keir Starmer says he's going to do when he comes into power. And I think that's perfectly reasonable for people to question that, given he made these clear promises. I mean, he knew when he made them, the year that it was and how far the election was. If he didn't believe he was going to deliver them in 2024, then he shouldn't have made them in the first place. And so I think it shows a ruthlessness to Starmer that I think perhaps goes under the radar. He comes across as quite a nice, reasonable person, but here's someone who's prepared to say whatever it took to get power, and I think that's really interesting.
I'll come to you in a second. Emma?
I think there's a difference between pragmatism and ruthlessness. I think he's being pragmatic, and he's looking at the situation the country's in now and trying to come up with policies and ideas for the next general election, which is a very different world and a very different country to 2020.
He could be bound by his word. He could say, well, I made those promises and so I feel I have to deliver them, and he's not saying that.
But then would we win the next general election if you stick rigidly to things that you
that's
promise?
What I'm saying.
No, it's pragmatism. If you stick rigidly to things that you promised 2 or 3 years ago, and everything around you's changing, does that make you a smart person? I don't think it does. I think you should move with the country, with the world. Things are changing rapidly. You need to be making policies that will suit 2024, not ones that suited 2020.
Did he believe in those policies, do you think, in 2019?
Yeah, I think he did. And I think they were right for that time. They're not right for now, some of them.
Just going to show this headline, Isabel, and get you to respond. Starmer's broken vows. It's in the Mail. Another policy U-turn as Labour says it won't scrap universal credit. Not surprising to see it there, but do you think the Conservatives are going to weaponise this?
I mean, I think they've already weaponised him flip-flopping. And I think we may be being too complimentary to him in saying that he's ruthless and prepared to say whatever to win. My reading of it is actually that he's had to work out on the job what he believes. And so he sort of poured one set of pledges into the leadership contest and then has spent the ensuing years trying to work out what he thinks. If you talk to a lot of people in the shadow cabinet about what he stands for, the first things they'll say to you, things about, you know, sort of running things better, getting an organisation working, turning up to meetings on time, which, you know, to be fair, in Westminster, turning up to meetings on time is seriously impressive. But that's not really a vision for the country. And I think that's what he's been struggling with over the past few years, is now trying to work out what does he actually want a Labour government to do. He's still not quite there yet. He's only just started to talk about Labour being in office for 2 terms and having a project rather than sort of being, I don't know, the bin man of politics coming to clear up all the mess from the Tories, which, in fairness, will take quite a lot of time.
Well, I mean, does it matter that he hasn't perhaps got a clear vision of what he wants to do?
Well, I think he started setting out that vision. He set out a decade of renewal last week in his speech. I think there is things there. We've set out some policies, but nobody wants to be a hostage to fortune this far out from a general election. Why would you do that? That would be silly.
Well, let's have a look at this headline in The Telegraph. Migrants to have bone and teeth X-rays to stop them falsely claiming to be children. Reliable tests to be used on those suspected of lying about their age to get into Britain, because you are treated differently and more generously if you are under 18. In other words, a child. The Home Office has indicated it's planning to press ahead with these scans to try and establish asylum seekers' age. Is it a good idea in the first place?
Are you asking me?
I am.
I thought I was going to have a comment on Keir Starmer. But
No, sorry about that.
This is not a new idea.
I know.
And it was actually proposed under the coalition government when I was the Children's Minister by the then Immigration Minister, Damien Green. But in fact, the Lib Dems squashed it, so it didn't happen.
Did you think it was a good idea then?
I'm open-minded on this because I think it's difficult. We have a serious problem with a number of people coming to the country via small boats, claiming to be adults who are not. And many of those coming across who are actually children are 16, 17-year-old children anyway. Those very younger children, it's only a small part of that proportion. We've got instances where we've had adults in schools claiming to be children alongside much younger children. There are safeguarding issues as well. The public are rightly concerned that there are people passing themselves off as children when they are clearly adults. I was down at Dover with the Home Affairs Select Committee. They just interviewed a young boy, supposedly, claiming to be 16. Eventually turned out he was 30. So this is happening on a regular basis. We also have children coming in claiming to be relatives, or an adult claiming that they're relatives. And it turns out they speak a completely different language. There's a lot of subterfuge going on, and it's really difficult from just an interview, skilled social workers doing those sorts of interviews, to determine whether somebody really is a child or not. And that's why we need to look at other ways of doing this. And this may be one, though I realise it is controversial.
Right, it is controversial. Would you be in favour of it, Emma?
Not really. I mean, I'm a former social worker and I've done these assessments with children before. And if you look at some of the independent analysis around would these X-rays actually work, they're saying no, they wouldn't. What they would do is cause trauma to already traumatised children. Nothing can be foolproof, but if you have enough social workers with the right skill set, which we don't have because that's another profession that the government have attacked and dismantled, then you can figure it out. You know, it's not that difficult. If you're trained properly, you can figure out. And of course, nothing, like Tim said, people will go through the gaps. Nothing can be foolproof. But I just don't think this is the answer. I think this is another gimmick from the Home Secretary who just can't handle the problem, so keeps coming up with things like this all the time to divert.
I mean, it was commissioned. It was a report done by scientists who have said that, yes, you could use X-rays and MRI scans. I mean, Emma says they would leave people traumatised, but they do say it should be voluntary. And Suella Braverman is reported, the Home Secretary, to be saying, no, she wants to make it a process, a procedure that would happen.
I think what the experts say is that one of the few ways you can determine somebody's age is by using X-rays or MRI, which you cannot just do from an interview, although you can, by asking a series of questions, catch people out and get to it that way. So all I'm saying is this is a practical way of trying to deal with a real problem we have at the moment, where there are adults passing themselves off as children and potentially becoming a safeguarding issue, as well as the additional protections that they have. And this needs to be looked at much more closely.
I just think you need to think about the children who are involved. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else on the panel has actually sat and met a child who is unaccompanied and completely alone in the world. The trauma of them just going through an interview, never mind introducing something like this, which could cause radiation problems as well. I just think
these are not young kids. These are older teenagers who look like adults as well.
You're talking about doing it for all children.
No, not all children. This would only be for those where there is a clear question mark over whether they are adults or they're actually still teenagers.
They could still be teenagers and children, and the fear and trauma that they've already gone through, you're going to subject them to more of that. I just don't think this is the right answer at all.
I mean, the accusations of a broken asylum system from across the House, I mean, is this really at the core of solving that?
It's clearly not at the core of solving it, and but you know, Tim makes a reasonable case that there are certain, I would imagine, a pretty small number of cases actually where this this might help. I'm not an expert enough to say whether it would, it wouldn't. I find rather distasteful, though, the way that things like this are quite clearly briefed into right-wing papers because they sound tough. There's a reason why this is a big fat headline there today. It's because the Home Secretary thinks things like this sound tough, and she needs politically to be seen to be acting tough on this because the system that she's running doesn't work at all. And it might help a bit, but it is clearly tinkering around the edges of a much wider problem that the government still hasn't even remotely got a handle on.
Particularly as not just Suella Braverman, but obviously Rishi Sunak saying he's going to fix this or stop the small boats coming across the channel. Is it, as Jack says, part of a sort of propaganda, if you like, machine?
Well, it's all painting in primary colours on an issue that is, I'd say, probably full of more grey areas than a lot of other public policy issues. I mean, and there are big questions that aren't answered. I mean, the biggest question was the one I think that Tim answered asked in a select committee session before Christmas about whether there are actually safe routes for claiming asylum, and that was one that the Home Secretary couldn't answer. And similarly, the Prime Minister, whenever he's asked about these issues, just starts talking about solving the boats because that's the priority of most people. I mean, he will move on from any topic onto stopping the boats.
Right. I mean, how politically perilous is this pledge to stop the boats by Rishi Sunak?
It's a big issue. It's a really big issue. A big issue for those of us on the south coast facing.
And is it perilous for him to claim he can stop it? Or
no,
do?
It has got to be dealt with because it is overwhelming the system. And certainly people, we had the Albanian ambassador in front of the Home Affairs Select Committee recently, where we had this big surge in the numbers of Albanians coming over in those months, where there were over half people coming in small boats from a country that is a safe country, for which other countries like Germany, Sweden, Netherlands do not admit any asylum seekers from Albania because they recognise it as just any EU-type country. It's safe, and yet we've had 12,000 Albanians, mostly single young men, coming here, claiming asylum, and in many cases now claiming that they're victims of trafficking. They are gaming the system, and people resent it because those who lose out most of all are those genuine asylum seekers, kids and others escaping danger, persecution, who are being bumped down the queue by people who are coming here purely as economic migrants and gaming the system. And that's what really annoys people.
Emma?
Well, I think we do need safe and legal routes, and this is the problem, that each time the government keeps saying that the asylum system's broken, they refuse to acknowledge they broke it. This is a total shambles. They've made cuts to the service, they've made cuts to Border Force, they've not had serious negotiations with other countries like France. You know, the relationship there has been damaged completely. There's all kinds of things that the government could have done, and they haven't. And so, again, they're using diversionary tactics like this headline today to take the heat away from their own feelings.
I mean, there is an admission, though, isn't there, by increasing the number of border staff that commit from Rishi Sunak, that there haven't been enough, which has led to that huge backlog of applications.
And there's got to be more.
Can I just take a look at the issue from the other end of the lens, if you like? You'll remember the Alf Dubs amendment, and that was to... And you supported it. Do you think that should be reinstated? And this is the idea, Alf Dubs, a Labour peer, who supported and brought forward the amendment that would allow children fleeing persecution, unaccompanied children, to be granted refuge without having to go through an application process.
Absolutely. So I've come up with two main suggestions for safe and legal routes, because if you are to deal robustly with those people who are not genuine asylum seekers coming to this country, then you can't give them the excuse, oh, there's no other way to get here other than in a boat. So we need safe and legal routes, which are, one, a family reunion scheme, as we used to have, which is generous for those people with genuine links, people legally in the UK already. That wouldn't take hundreds of thousands of people at all. We're talking about thousands. And a Dub scheme Mark II, where he very successfully brought over 480 kids, I think, genuinely in places of danger.
Well, a lot of them from Syria, I think, aren't they? Yes.
A lot from Syria, but other countries as well, who don't fit into these other schemes that there are at the moment, assimilated them into society, gave them a safe haven here. There are a lot more like that, and I think people would genuinely feel sympathetic.
And you'd support that too, Emma, I presume?
Course, yes.
All right. Well, look, let's move on and talk about Prince Harry. You heard and saw in the headlines, he's been giving an interview overnight in the United States. He's been doing a lot of interviews, and of course the book is out. I'm going to show you a little bit more of that clip where he is talking about comments from his new memoir, Spare, where he discussed the number of people he killed while serving in Afghanistan. Now, those comments have been criticised by senior military figures, but Prince Harry here is criticising the media for the way his comments have been reported. Let's take a look.
without doubt, the most dangerous lie that they have told is that I somehow boasted about the number of people that I killed in Afghanistan. It wasn't like, here's just one line. They had the whole section, they ripped it away and just said, here it is, he's boasting on this. When, as you say, that you've read it, and everybody else will hopefully be able to have a chance to read it. And that's dangerous. And my words are not dangerous, but the spin of my words are very dangerous.
Now, your response, Tim, first of all, to the interview and the book and memoir in general.
I'm just sick of it. If you play with fire, don't be surprised at the consequences. And I feel terribly for the royal family, not least the King and his brother, so soon after the death of the Queen as well. This is not the way that members of the royal family should be behaving. I'm particularly aggrieved, and my constituents are particularly aggrieved, because I'm a Sussex MP. He has the title, and his wife, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. He's only the second Duke of Sussex. We had one who died back in 1843, and the title went extinct. And his wife wasn't recognised because the marriage wasn't recognised. So she was the first Duchess of Sussex, Meghan. So there was great excitement.
So you want to take
Sussex.
And you want to take the
title away? They were going to represent us. They came on one day's visit, and then what's happened ever since? He's become, I'm afraid, an embarrassment. He should take the words of his grandfather, which was look up, look out, say less, do more, get on with it.
Emma?
I've not read his book or seen any of his interviews, and you know, as far as I'm concerned, this is a family matter, and it's not for MPs to wade into.
Except, of course,
it is.
Tim Lawton has waded in, to use your words in that sense, in quite a major way, calling for the dukedom to be taken away. Would you support that?
That's a decision for the King and the King alone.
I don't think the King can do it because it would be an act of Parliament. I mean, it's interesting hearing Tim talk about this. Do you think it's legitimate to call for their title to be taken away?
If it's something that Parliament can do, and Tim's an MP, then it's definitely legitimate for him to say it. I mean, I think the whole thing's just a bit farcical. If you look at the state of the country, you look at the state of our health service, the fact that nothing works, as we were talking about earlier, for MPs to be worrying too much, and I don't mean Tim personally, about this, or any of us to be talking too much about this, I think is a little bit silly. Whether so-and-so, I mean, titles in the 21st century are themselves a little bit silly, aren't they? And there's clearly someone who's very emotionally hurt and a family that's pretty much emotionally destroyed, and that is a matter for them. I don't think it needs to be such a big matter for them.
We're going to welcome viewers from the BBC News Channel. Just before I go to you, Isabel, to ask for your reaction to generally the publicity around Prince Harry and the reaction from some MPs like Tim.
I mean, I think it's interesting that quite a limited number of MPs have actually wanted to comment on this. Most, like Emma, have sort of said, no, not going there, just going to stay away from this. And, yeah, I can understand why Tim would want to, but I found it really interesting how quiet Westminster has been on this generally. I think the memoir itself and the interviews, they do feel a bit like a sort of public therapy session, which I would question the wisdom of. As someone who's seen more than their fair share of counsellors and psychotherapists over the past few years, I tend to think that some things, particularly trauma, are best kept within a sort of safe space of a therapy room rather than taken out into the public where, you know, lots of people are going to react negatively, which is not actually going to help Prince Harry at all to resolve how he's feeling about his, you know, about his trauma over his mother, but also his disputes with his brother. I mean, there has become a bit of a meme about, you know, some of his gripes with his brother in comparison to some of the things that I did to my brothers and, you know, my brothers did to me when we were growing up. I think a lot of people who've got siblings have sort of said, oh, I did a lot worse than ignore him at school and that sort of thing. Or, you know, I'm still telling my brother to shave his beard off now. I've now done it on live TV.
Well, we're looking forward to your memoir, of course, about that, Isabel. But, I mean, this idea of trauma and grief being played out, I mean, that is where Prince Harry and Meghan have got a lot of sympathy, that this is perhaps cathartic for them in the way. However, some people find it rather cringy.
I think there's always... Look, I've written a book about mental health, and I think being open about your mental health is really important. But I think there is also a beauty in privacy, and there are certain things that I've never talked about publicly to do with my mental health because it wouldn't help me, and actually it would become voyeuristic for other people as well. And I think drawing the line quite tightly is really important for your own well-being and actually for the benefit of other people as well. There's stuff that people don't need to know. We don't need to know what Prince Harry said to the Queen on her deathbed, for instance. I think things like that are deeply private, and there's a beauty in that privacy.
Well, in the spirit of what Isabel has just said, you tweeted this, Tim, in response. Was that the right thing to do with that sort of sentiment on the basis of what we've just heard from Isabel? Because clearly Prince Harry is suffering to some extent from grief and trauma.
I just got so exasperated. I was getting so many emails from constituents, and I was actually on holiday last week, and yet another interview with him comes on every English language news channel that was on this television set when I was abroad. Had all these interviews with Prince Harry, and it's just so wearing. He doesn't need to say it. It's deeply damaging. These things should be kept private. And Isabel makes an absolutely right point. So I'm afraid it was a slightly intemperate tweet. I also tweeted soon after that my comments about the genocide against Armenians going on at the moment, which is a very serious issue in another part of the world. So then everybody piles in. And so I had an awful lot of people, by a large margin, saying, well said. I would have said that, perhaps not quite in the same way, although there were asterisks, so, you know, just shut the flip up. But then I had a load of people criticising me. And then if you look at their Twitter profiles and everything, these are all left-wing people who hate the royal family and want to abolish the monarchy anyway. So the duplicitousness of those then attacking me, and not a single one.
All right. Well, you think you've managed to turn it around, Emma. Would you like to respond to that?
Wanted to do anything about genocide against the Armenians.
Well, that's just a ridiculous thing to say that the whole left is against the monarchy.
Not the whole left. Not the whole.
I mean, you've got a bunch of MPs in the Labour Party who've all sworn allegiance to His Majesty. How can we possibly
all of you,
be
hopefully. No, I'm not making generalisation. I'm saying those people.
You are.
No, I'm saying those people attacked me. By and large, were people who have no time for the monarchy.
Well, what are you going to do about it?
Using that to attack the royal family.
How do you know that?
So
Did you open up a dialogue with them and chat to them all?
So I looked at their Twitter profiles and some of the things they've been tweeted, and they are not people who are great monarchists.
Did you check the Labour Party membership?
Well, all right. Well, hang on. At a more practical level, though, Tim, what are you going to do about it? You want them to lose their titles. How can you make that happen?
No, so Bob Seeley, the member for the Isle of Wight, is actually bringing forward a private member's bill next week to amend the 1917 Titles Deprivation Act, because this did happen before in the First World War. So there is a mechanism for it, but it has to be parliamentary legislation. I'm sure that won't get anywhere, but I just hope that makes the message clear that we're fed up of this, and actually he just needs less is more. They complained about their lack of privacy, they moved to the States, and now they're using every platform of every media service across the world, which just seems a bit ironic to me.
All right, well, we'll pause there for a moment as we're coming up to Prime Minister's questions in a few minutes' time. We might be able to show you inside the chamber. It is, of course, the first one of 2023. Yes, filling up nicely there for Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. We'll have my colleague Peter Barnes from the Political Research Unit standing by, watching proceedings in case there are any dubious or debatable statistics or facts that come up. God, perish the thought. In terms of less is more, Jack, what about this first PMQs? What are your predictions for how this year is going to unfold after the tumult of last year?
I predict PMQs is going to be a much more tedious affair than it was in 2022, with two rather more, I don't want to say boring, because that's a bit harsh, but a bit more normal politicians at the dispatch box than perhaps particularly the Conservative Party were providing us with last year. The sort of unbelievable knockabout fun that we may have enjoyed, but I think is a thing of the past. You know, Keir versus Rishi is not a particularly appetising subject for 12 o'clock, much as I don't want your viewers to be switching off
it's
now,
a really appetising subject, particularly the analysis that's going to come afterwards. What do you think Keir Starmer will actually decide to take the Prime Minister to task over?
It would be very foolish for me to make a prediction 1 minute before he comes on, but if I was him, I'd be going on the health service, because it's the main thing that everyone's worried about.
Isabel?
Yeah, and I think that's the problem for the government, is that the strikes in the health service aren't really about pay anymore. They feel to the public about the state of the NHS, which is very dangerous for ministers.
Yeah, and that is, of course, the problem for the government. Would you agree with that?
No,
that it will become about why haven't the Conservatives done more pre the pandemic to deal with the health service?
We have a serious problem with healthcare at the moment. It's no point in denying that. Whether it's people complaining they can't get a face-to-face interview with their GPs, and yet our GPs, I know, are working flat out. I met some GPs working 6 days a week just before Christmas as well. That they're waiting too long to get their operations or treatment in hospital, and why they are paying vast care fees for people in care homes, and then there are so many people who can't get into care homes as well, who are taking up the bed. So there's a huge problem. But the Prime Minister's recognised this. It's the #1 priority, along with the cost of living crisis at the moment. It's why the extra money has come in to get people out of hospital who come out of hospital.
It has just come in, but £200 million.
We do need to settle with the nurses.
Emma, do you think that is and what Keir Starmer should go on today?
Yeah, and just to pick up on some of the earlier comments, I long for the day when politics is boring again. I think it should be boring and serious. I've had enough of all the drama and all of the excitement. I want it to be boring. I want it to be serious. I want me to crack on and do the jobs I'm supposed to do.
Right.
What did you make of the idea from Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, about reforming, perhaps abolishing the sort of GP setup that has existed pretty well since the Second World War as self-employed businesses, partners in practices, and sort of nationalising it?
I wasn't overly enamoured by it, and I think it probably needs more debate with GPs before that goes anywhere.
Oh, right, so you would be happy to stick with the service. I mean, it was quite an eye-catching idea.
I mean, it's pretty obvious that Wes Streeting, as Shadow Health Secretary, is prepared to think pretty radically in a way that we haven't heard the Labour Party talk about the health service in quite a long time. What I'm not clear about is where the public is on that, to be honest. I mean, I think the idea that the health service needs reforming is probably one that people are prepared to accept. The detail of it, though, I haven't sort of seen detailed polling, so from a political point of view, it certainly seems it's interesting to see them that they're going there, but I don't know whether it's a vote winner or not.
Right, what do you think? I mean, because people complain about GPs not being able to get an appointment, etc. Not all GPs are signed up to the idea of having practices and being self-employed. Yeah. I mean, you know, it's difficult to know where the public are.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the public think that GPs are already nationalised, so this debate is a bit of a sort of...
It's the biggest private part of the National Health Service.
Exactly, and I mean, that when Sajid Javid made pretty much the same proposal when he was Health Secretary, I did quite enjoy doctors getting cross that they might be being nationalised by the Tories, which is not normally the way round things are.
It's time for PMQs.
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
There are no NHS dentists taking on patients in Lancaster and Fleetwood, and for those constituents of mine lucky enough to have one, they're waiting months for an appointment. So can I ask the Prime Minister how long he had to wait for his last NHS dentist appointment?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, as a result of the new reformed NHS dentistry contract, there are now more NHS dentists across the UK with more funding, making sure people can get the treatment they need. But, Mr. Speaker, let me answer the lady directly. I am registered with an NHS GP. I have used independent healthcare in the past. I'll answer her question. I am registered with NHS GP. I have used independent healthcare in the past, and I'm also grateful to the Friarage Hospital for the fantastic care they've given my family over the years. But the truth is, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to come from an NHS family, and that's why I'm passionately committed to protecting it with more funding, more doctors and nurses, and a clear plan to cut the waiting list.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You are 24 times more likely to become a doctor if a parent is a doctor, 17 times more likely to become a lawyer if a parent is a lawyer, and there is a lower proportion of disadvantaged young people being admitted to degree-level apprenticeships by employers than to degrees by universities. So I warmly welcome what my right honourable friend set out last week about education and family. But does he agree with me we also need our universities, employers and professions playing their part to improve social mobility in the UK?
Well, Mr. Speaker, everyone should have the opportunity to succeed, and my honourable friend is absolutely right that we all have a part to play. That's why I'm pleased the Social Mobility Commission is working to provide new information to young people about the opportunities available to them, but also a toolkit for employers so that they can also play their part in improving social mobility.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the 13 years of the last Labour government, there were no national NHS strikes. If the Prime Minister had negotiated with the nurses before Christmas, they wouldn't be on strike. if he'd negotiated with the ambulance workers, they wouldn't be on strike either. So why is he choosing to prolong the misery rather than end these strikes?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've always been clear that we want to have constructive dialogue with the unions. That is also why, when it comes to the issue of pay, we have accepted in full the independent recommendations of the pay review bodies. But now the honourable gentleman simply doesn't have a policy when it comes to this question. If he wants, he talks about wanting to end the strikes. The question for him is simple then. Why does he not support our minimum safety legislation? We all know why. We all know why, Mr. Speaker. It's because he's on the side of his union paymasters, not patients.
Mr. Speaker, when I clapped nurses, I meant it. His response to the greatest crisis in the history of the NHS is to threaten to sack our nurses. His Transport Secretary says it's not the solution. His Education Secretary hopes it won't apply in schools. His own assessments say it could increase the number of strikes. The simple truth is you can't legislate your way out of 13 years of failure. Between 2010 and 2019, before anyone had heard of COVID, Prime Minister, the number of people stuck on the NHS waiting list doubled. Why do patients always wait longer under the Tories?
Whoa. This is the new year. I want to start off with the refreshed chamber, but certainly not by interruption. Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he talks about the minimum safety legislation. Let's just talk about it a little bit further, because this is a simple proposition that no one denies the union's freedom to strike, but it is also important to balance that with people's right to have access to life-saving healthcare at the same time. Mr. Speaker, this shouldn't be controversial. This shouldn't be controversial. The International Labour Organization supports minimum service levels. They're present in France, in Italy, in Spain. Normally, he's in favour of more European alignment, Mr. Speaker. Why not now?
Mr. Speaker, they've gone from clapping the nurses to sacking the nurses. It's that simple. And to add insult to injury, they're the cause of the crisis. His government commissioned a report on waiting times. He knows this. His own report says this is not a COVID problem, it's 10 years of managed decline. As a result, 7.2 million people are now waiting for treatment. He says he wants to be held to account over that. So let's be very clear. Is his promise merely to get those numbers back to where they were before COVID, that's 4.6 million, or back to where Labour had them in 2010, almost half of that? Which is it?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, again, let's just start with the facts. The honourable gentleman seems to completely ignore the fact that not just in England, but in Scotland and in Wales and in many other European countries, COVID has had an extraordinary impact on health services. Now we have a very clear plan to bring the waiting list down, and it's one that the NHS supports. But I tell you what the NHS doesn't need. What they don't need is Labour's idea. What they don't need is Labour's only idea, which is for another completely disruptive, top-down, unfunded reorganisation buying out every single GP contract. Now, these aren't my words, Mr. Speaker. The CEO of the Nuffield Trust said it will cost a fortune and it's out of date, just like the Labour Party.
Mr. Speaker, so he can't tell us how much he'll reduce waiting lists by or when. So much for accountability that he wants. As ever with this Prime Minister, you scratch the surface and you find there is nothing there. Last month, 1.4 million people waited more than 4 weeks for a GP appointment. When Labour left government, you were guaranteed an appointment in 2 days. When does the Prime Minister expect to get back to that?
Well, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to waiting lists, we've already eliminated two-year wait lists, done last year. We're on track. We're on track. We're on track this spring to eliminate those waiting 18 months, with a clear plan to go further, to eliminate those waiting 52 weeks by next spring. And we're doing that with record funding, more community diagnostic centres, more surgical hubs and more patient choice. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, I've made tackling wait lists one of my 5 priorities. But what are his? They seem to change every single week. Right? That first, he was against NHS outsourcing. Now, he's apparently in favour of it. He's inconsistent, unprincipled, and in hock to his I
wonder if Order. Can I just remind the Prime Minister, it's Prime Minister's questions, not opposition questions. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I heard the Prime Minister saying he's now registered with an NHS doctor, so he'll soon enjoy the experience of waiting on hold every morning at 8 a.m. to get a GP appointment. But I can tell him that those that are waiting now don't want another round of empty promises or boasting about what he's done. They just want to know when they'll be able to see a doctor. And this is not just about routine care. There could be nothing more terrifying than being told you might have cancer. That's why the last Labour government brought in a guarantee you'd been seen by a specialist within 2 weeks. Today, 50,000 people are waiting longer than that. 50,000. And everyone in this House will appreciate the anxiety that they're feeling. So when will cancer patients once again get the certainty of quick care that they got under Labour?
Mr. Speaker, why is there a challenge with cancer times right now? I tell you, again, it's just... absolutely no understanding of the situation, Mr. Speaker. What happened to cancer referrals during COVID? They went down by almost 2/3, Mr. Speaker. That was because of a pandemic that they went down. And by the way, if we had stayed and listened to him, we'd still be in lockdown and there'd be a bit more waiting lists, right, Mr. Speaker? But actually, right now, there are record levels of cancer treatment as we catch up with those missed things. But he talks about what's terrifying, Mr. Speaker. What's terrifying is right now. What's terrifying is that right now, people not knowing whether when they call 999, they will get the treatment that they need. Now, Mr. Speaker, in Australia and Canada and the US, they ban strikes on blue light services. We're not doing that. All we're saying is that in these emergency services, patients should be able to rely on a basic level of life-saving care. Why is he against that, Mr. Speaker?
There's not a minimum level of service any day because they've broken the NHS. And he's not promising that people will get to see a doctor in a few days like they did under Labour. He's not promising that cancer patients would get urgent treatment as they did under Labour. He's not even promising an NHS that puts patients first like it did under Labour. No, he's promising that one day, although he can't say when, their record high waiting lists will stop growing. And that's it. After 13 years in government, what does it say? But the best they can offer is that at some point they might stop making things worse.
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the NHS, it's crystal clear. The Conservatives on the side of patients, Labour on the side of their union paymasters. Mr. Speaker, I've laid out my priorities for the country. Waiting lists down, inflation down, debt down, growth up, and the boat's stopped, Mr. Speaker. All he does is flip from one thing to another, and that's the difference between him and me. He's focused on petty politics. I'm delivering for Britain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of my constituents in Truro and Falmouth, actually, I would like to thank all of the health and social care professions in Cornwall for all of the hard work they're doing in a particularly difficult winter. In Cornwall, we don't get any respite in the summer because everybody comes to Cornwall for the their holidays, which is brilliant. But so there is no respite in the summer or the winter for our health and social care professionals. And in addition to that, Mr. Speaker, when we're trying to recruit people into social care, which is a vocation, they are competing with hospitality. And I would like to ask my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, whether he is aware of these extra challenges that places like Cornwall face in recruitment and retention.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to shine a spotlight, and I share with her and be incredibly proud of all our social care workers for the commitment that they have to their profession. And that's why many of them will benefit this spring from an almost 10% increase in the national living wage, putting an extra £1,600 in their pay slips. But also, we want to make sure that they feel valued with professional development, training and career progression, and the £500 million investment we're putting into the social care workforce will do exactly that for hers and other workers.
We now come to the leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, the longest and deepest recession in the entire G7. Brexit, 13 years of Tory rule. The energy price crisis, inflation and interest rates. If the people of Scotland are to do the math, as the Prime Minister so hopes, will they not come to the conclusion that this union simply doesn't add up?
Well, I'm pleased the honourable gentleman brought up energy, and he's right to do that, because energy, and when it comes to the economy, is incredibly important to Scotland's energy, and actually Scotland will play a fantastic part in helping us transition to net zero. But what we do now know is that the Scottish Government don't want to support Scottish energy industry and the 200,000 jobs that it produces. I'm keen to work with the Scottish Government to support the North Sea, because it's something that we're all very proud of in the United Kingdom.
But, Mr. Speaker, if he wants to talk about the fact that Scotland is energy-rich but fuel-poor on Westminster's watch, I am more than happy to do so. But for today, let's reflect upon numbers, and in particular, those numbers which were shone a light on by Sam Coates of Sky, in particular those in relation to the Prime Minister's favourite potential successor, which showed that over the course of 4 months, from 4 speeches, he raked in excess of £1 million. Does the Prime Minister not find it utterly perverse that senior members of the Conservative Party are feathering their nest in this way, whilst at the same time seeking to deny working people the opportunity to strike for fair pay?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't think we need to talk about our predecessors, but I remember. I think it was one of his predecessors that did indeed work for Russia Today, if I'm not mistaken. But what I would say is he talks about the priorities. You know, yesterday the SNP spent time talking yet more about independence at a time when we should be talking about delivering for people across the United Kingdom, focusing on their jobs, improving the NHS across the UK, in Scotland as in everywhere else. That's the kind of thing I want to talk to the Scottish Government about, and I hope that he'll work with me to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Conservative governments have a proud record of supporting the UK steel industry. So can I thank my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for the work that he has already done for steel. He will know that steel is a vital strategic industry. Absolutely. It is essential for everything we do, from defence to growth. So can I ask him, will he do everything he can to ensure that we're always able to make steel in this country? And does he agree with me that steel is always safest under a Conservative...
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is a fantastic champion for the steel industry, and this government remains committed to a thriving UK steel industry. That's why our support for steel includes almost £800 million in relief for electricity costs, and steel companies are eligible to bid for up to £1.5 billion in capital grants to speed their transition to net zero steel production.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
And I'm sure the whole House will wish to join me in wishing all the best to Gareth Bale, the former captain of the Wales men's soccer team, who's been a national inspiration and took Wales to the Football World Cup. This Tory government attacks dedicated health and ambulance staff, but disruption from strikes is as nothing compared with the chronic disruption caused every day by their 13 years butchering of health budgets. Meanwhile, Labour's Health Secretary in Wales follows the Tory playbook, blaming patients themselves for the standards of their health. But the reality is this. Health services in Wales suffer from a combination of mismanagement by Labour and a Westminster funding system which perpetuates poverty.
Yeah, indeed.
Levelling up.
Prime Minister. Question. Far too long. The Prime Minister must have got
Will you therefore commit to funding Wales in public?
Prime Minister, you can't go on forever, Liz.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me join with the Honourable Lady as a Southampton fan. Gareth Bale, also a hero of mine as well, and I wish him well. But when it comes to funding Wales, it's as a result of the funding from Barnet that the Welsh Government receives around significantly more funding than the NHS in England, but also £1.2 billion of extra funding as a result of the autumn statement. And what I said to the Leader of the Opposition, this isn't about actually political point scoring. The NHS is under pressure in Wales, as it is in Scotland and in England, in large part because of the impact of a global pandemic, and she would do well to recognise that.
David Goodwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, unlike parties opposite, including the Scottish National Party and even the member for Aberdeen South, I know my right honourable friend supports or recognises the critical role that oil and gas companies and their employees critically have in not only providing energy security but also the delivery of the energy transition to net zero. Can he therefore confirm that this government's ongoing commitment to expanding on our carbon capture utilisation and storage capacity, including the Acorn project in St Fergus in my constituency, and can he provide an update on the Track 2 sequencing?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is a fantastic champion and campaigner for this project. We will invest up to £1 billion to establish carbon capture and storage in 4 industrial clusters by 2030. We very much recognise the benefits of the Scottish cluster and the role it could play in decarbonisation, and we're progressing our Track 2 and we'll set out further details in due course.
Davis Jones.
Mr. Speaker, the Times recently reported that schools across the UK are in crisis as the effects of online influencer Andrew Tate's vile misogyny infiltrates our classrooms and society. Teachers are now having to develop their own resources to re-educate boys who are being brainwashed online by his deeply toxic messaging. The Prime Minister has been too slow to recognise this damage this is causing. What has he done? What is his government doing to tackle this misogyny, this incel culture and the radicalisation of young men in this country? And will he commit to giving teachers the resources that they need to address this problem head-on?
Mr. Speaker, with regard to funding, we announced in the autumn statement £2 billion of extra funding for our schools. But I'm also proud that this government has introduced the world-leading, world-first online safety bill, which specifically improves protections for children and puts very strict obligations and penalties on tech companies for enforcing them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Building a Brighter Future project at Torbay Hospital will be the biggest single investment in South Devon's healthcare services since the NHS was founded in 1948. Can you assure me the government's commitment to it remains unchanged?
My honourable friend is a fantastic champion for his local hospital and his constituents. I'm pleased to say that the new hospital scheme for Torbay is part of our plan to deliver dozens more hospitals by 2030. We will remain committed to the delivery of that new hospital, and I'm pleased that his trust are talking to the new hospital programme team about how to progress those plans.
Alex Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Taxpayers are set to lose tens of millions of pounds after the transfer of valuable public assets to 2 Teesside businessmen, all without a full and transparent procurement process. And a relative of one of those people is now benefiting from millions of pounds worth of scrap from the same Teesworks site. Will the Prime Minister launch an inquiry into these crony contracts? And whilst he's at it, tell his Environment Secretary to get serious about the environmental disaster of the Teesside coast, which is linked to the site.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman will already be aware, DEFRA already carried out a comprehensive, evidence-led investigation, considered everything robustly and concluded that natural causes was most likely responsible for some of the things that we saw. But we recognise people want a thorough investigation of this issue, and DEFRA have confirmed that an independent panel will be set up to report quickly.
Philip Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour-controlled Bradford Council continually neglect
the needs of Bingley and other parts of my constituency as they pour all of their money into their inner city heartlands. Therefore, my constituents look to the government in order to put right their failings. That's why the Levelling Up Fund is so important. So, will the Prime Minister insist that the Levelling Up Fund for Bingley, which has been submitted, which will also unlock many millions of pounds of private sector investment, will he insist that that bid is successful when the announcement's made in the near future?
What about mine? Well, Mr. Speaker, unlike the Labour Council, my honourable friend is a fantastic champion for his constituents in Bingley. As I have told him previously, I can't comment on individual bids, but I wish him every success and will be following with close interest how it proceeds.
Caroline Harris. Caroline Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister believe that over 40,000 interactions by either social media, email or letter regarding the poor customer service and working conditions at the delivery company Every warrants an investigation by the relevant government department? His ministers in Bays think not. But I'm sure the Prime Minister would want the general public to believe that he at least is interested enough in this problem to take action.
Prime Minister.
So, well, Mr. Speaker, I'm aware that other government ministers have looked into this issue and are currently considering the matter at hand, and I'd be happy to write to her when we learn more about the situation.
The Bruce.
Speaker, does the Prime Minister agree that the right way to secure the best future for the British people is to deliver on the people's priorities and secure a strong economy?
Yeah.
And will he confirm that he will not make any unfunded spending commitments which would rack up billions of debt, as the party opposite have done in the last week?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. If we want to safeguard the future of our public services and make sure that our young people inherit a strong economy, we must be disciplined on spending and borrowing. She's absolutely right about no unfunded spending commitments. Unlike, as she says, the party opposite, at last count, £90 billion of unfunded spending commitments. It's the same old Labour, Mr. Speaker. They always run out of other people's money.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Less than half of Wakefield's children managed to see an NHS dentist last year. My constituent, Mr. Fakazai's 6-year-old daughter, has never seen an NHS dentist. She has 10 teeth, which are black with decay, and is often crying with pain. Her father feels helpless. He's called every dentist in Wakefield for a place, but hasn't managed to secure one. Over 25% of 5-year-olds in Wakefield already have visible tooth decay. So when will the Prime Minister stop dithering and take action to address our national dental emergency?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about the case raised by the honourable gentleman. I'm happy to look into that specific one more closely. But as I said in answer to an earlier question, we have recently reformed the NHS dentistry contract, hundreds of millions of pounds of more funding and more dentists, which should make a difference around the country. But I'll write to him on the specific case.
Liz Ross.
Scotland's oil and gas industry supports 90,000 Scottish jobs, but yesterday Nicola Sturgeon's SNP government published plans calling for as fast as possible shutdown of the industry and an end to new exploration. These plans are naive and reckless and were previously described by the SNP leader in this House as crazy. So will the Prime Minister reaffirm his support for Scotland's oil and gas workers and the future of our industry?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, honourable friend is absolutely right. We know that we will have to rely on hydrocarbons for decades to come as we transition to net zero. And consuming oil and gas from the North Sea means less than half the carbon footprint of importing that same oil and gas, which is obviously makes sense to do it here and in the process support tens of thousands of jobs in Scotland. So I can reassure him that the Scottish oil and gas industry has this government's wholehearted support.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Tory crisis in the NHS includes ophthalmology, the largest and busiest outpatient service. There are more than 650,000 people waiting to see an eye care specialist. Will the Prime Minister back my bill calling for a national eye health strategy that would ensure that nobody waiting to see a specialist will go without and potentially lead to a complete loss of sight?
Prime Minister. Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her campaigning in this area, and we are taking action to improve things. Over the past 5 years, the National Institute for Health and Care Research has invested more than £100 million to support research into eye conditions, but I know that there's more we can do, and my Honourable friend, the Minister, I believe, is sitting down to talk to the Honourable Lady in due course, and I look forward to hearing about those comments.
Duncan Smith. Mr. Speaker, today I and others met with Sebastian Lai, the son of Jimmy Lai, who languishes in prison, the ex-owner of Apple Daily. I remind my right honourable friend that he is a British citizen and a British passport holder, and he now faces a trial at the end of the year in which he can be incarcerated under the new national security laws for life. For what? For publishing truth to power. Will my right honourable friend please now direct the rest of his government, particularly the Foreign Office, now to warn the Chinese government, if they persist with this, he, and alongside the Americans who have already done this, will threaten that the use of common law in Hong Kong will be taken away.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend speaks with authority on these issues, and I thank him for his continued engagement on this critical issue. He knows the actions we have already taken with regard to Hong Kong, not least providing refuge for hundreds of thousands of people here, and being robust in standing up to what we believe to be Chinese aggression and indeed an undermining of the settlement that we fought so hard to achieve. He has my absolute assurance I will continue to remain engaged and robust on this, and I look forward to sitting down with him to discuss this particular issue in more detail as soon as possible.
We're Hobbs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Half of British women and a fifth of men have been sexually harassed at work or a place of study. The government's own figures show that 41 of those said their perpetrators faced no consequences. Thanks to cross-party and government support, my private member's bill, which has now passed committee stage, will bring about a culture change to protect workers from harassment and sexual harassment, both from fellow employees and third-party individuals. Will the Prime Minister join me in celebrating the cross-party work on this important change in the law, and by personally supporting its aims and objectives and ensuring its safe continued passage through this Parliament?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her important work on this issue? And sexual harassment has absolutely no place in the workplace, and everyone should be able to feel safe at work. Now, of course, we need to make sure that legislation doesn't have unintended consequences, but I know she is meeting with my right honourable friend, the Minister for Women and Equalities, to discuss her bill further, and I look forward to hearing her progress on that meeting.
Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the disgusting anti-Semitic, anti-vax conspiracy theories that have been promulgated online this morning are not only deeply offensive but anti-scientific and have no place in this House or in our wider society?
Prime Minister. Well, can I join with my right honourable friend in completely condemning those types of comments that we saw this morning in the strongest possible terms? Obviously, it is utterly unacceptable to make linkages and use language like that, and I'm determined that the scourge of anti-Semitism is eradicated. It has absolutely no place in our society, and I know that the previous few years have been challenging for the Jewish community, and I never want them to experience anything like that ever again.
Final question, Nadia Whitten.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a 95-year-old constituent of mine spent 41 hours in A&E. When will the Prime Minister admit that the NHS is collapsing because of 13 years of underfunding and do something about it instead of blaming the nurses striking to save it?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'm very sorry to hear about the experience of the elderly constituent that the Honourable Lady raised, and my sympathies go out to her. But this is not about blaming anybody. This is about recognising that the NHS, whether in Scotland, whether in Wales, where it is run by the Labour Party, whether here in England, is facing pressure as we recover from a pandemic. The right thing to do is to have a clear plan in place to work with doctors and nurses to ease that pressure. That's what we're focused on doing, and that's what our plans will deliver.
Right, that completes Prime Minister's questions. We'll just let the
of this first PMQs of 2023. Let's welcome our guests for this part of Politics Live for the government. Victoria Atkins, Treasury Minister, Peter Carr for the Labour Party, Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, and Vicky Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. Well, let's start off with what Rishi Sunak said at the very beginning of Prime Minister's questions, which he did go some way in answering the question that had been put repeatedly to him at the weekend, which is whether he uses private healthcare or registered with an NHS GP. He said he is registered with an NHS GP. He admitted, used independent healthcare in the past, and he's grateful to the NHS for the fantastic care that they've given him and his family over the years. Vicky, what did you make of it?
Well, I think they must have decided that it was just time to answer the question. I mean, this has been asked of him several times, actually, you know, during the leadership contest and the rest of it. And to be honest, by not answering, everyone assumed, well, you obviously are using private healthcare. So I think probably this was the best strategy just to answer it. But of course, it immediately then raises loads of other questions. So he said, I'm registered with an NHS GP. People will say, what, when? You know, was that this week? Have you ever actually managed to get an appointment? Have you used it? And then, of course, all those more personal questions about his healthcare, I guess. And I suppose originally that was him saying, look, this is no one's business, effectively, and my healthcare is up to me. But, you know, this is it's a sticky point for lots of politicians when it comes to it. You know, are you better able to understand the problems in the NHS if you use it and use it regularly, or does it not make any difference? But clearly, you know, the questions were being asked. Everyone was assuming certain things. He just decided today, finally, to come out and answer the question.
Why didn't he just answer the question in the way he did today on Sunday?
I mean, look, I wouldn't want to assume knowledge of the decisions and processes that the Prime Minister is going through when it comes to interview technique. But what I do know is that today he has answered that question. I think actually, you know, the NHS isn't about one person. It's about the entire population of 60 million people and how the service is coping with this very difficult winter. And I know we'll come on to discussions about funding and everything else, but the truth is we have all of the hangover, as I call it, following the pandemic. We have an incredibly difficult winter in terms of flu and COVID and strep A and all these other pressures.
And we're going to talk about it. I mean, without being too flippant, one might say, did he just sign up with an NHS GP on Monday?
No, I don't think that's the case. I mean, I haven't pried because actually, you know, our own.
What do you think it is private matter then?
I do actually, and it's we are responsible for developing policies, for working with NHS professionals to deliver those services for our constituents. And I guess I'm just a little bit nervous about directing this all onto one person.
Well,
I think we need to look across government at the work we're doing. For example, the 35,000 more doctors in the NHS since 2010, the 47,000 more nurses, and what we can do to help prepare the NHS for the future.
Well, then how do you explain the state of the NHS right now?
Well, as I said, I think we have a real problem with the hangover from the pandemic. We heard in PMQs about some of the impacts that it has had on,
Except, Victoria, just to interject here, the number of people on the waiting list in England waiting for NHS treatment is 7.2 million. It's a huge number of people by historic standards. Now, that is a failure of this government because there were 4.2 million on the waiting list before the pandemic started.
And the Prime Minister, in his 5 priorities that he set last week, cutting waiting lists is one of those 5. But also, actually, we've managed to eliminate, we are working our way through the backlog with the help, obviously, of the NHS, working our way through the backlog and very significantly are having to deal with some of the impacts of having, people not being able to turn up to hospital for treatment during the pandemic because of the nightmare that the pandemic presented to us. But, of course, innovation, such as our community diagnostic centres and so on, is going to help with that.
You accept that the pandemic is a major cause of the problems that the country is facing now in terms of NHS delivery?
The pandemic is one of the pressures which have led to the situation we have now. But the fundamental one is that the resilience of the NHS has been whittled out in the years leading up to it. There were 4.3 million people, which was a historic waiting list going into it. You have to understand it's not just also hospitals at the moment. In the last month, there was 1.3 million people who had to wait more than 4 weeks to see a GP. There was 45,000 people who had to wait for more than 4 hours to get admitted into A&E. There's 40,000 people who are waiting to get out of A&E to be admitted into hospital in the last month. And we know that there are tens of thousands of people at the other end. So the front door to our health service, the GPs, is broken. The hospital system is broken, and the discharge at the end is broken because there's nowhere for people to go, because there's no care packages for domiciliary care, and there's not enough care places in care homes. So the system is broken. That's not all because of COVID. That's broken through mismanagement and underfunding and poor decisions made by this government.
And would you say the same, then, about the Labour government in Wales, where there are also huge pressures on the NHS? Labour's been in government for quite some time there, so you can blame the Conservative government, the UK Conservative government, but waiting times for hospital treatment in Wales have again reached record levels. Is that Labour's fault?
What we aspire to do is to run the health service from Westminster and the government from Westminster. And when you look at the last 13 years of Labour government, all of the indications went in the right direction in all parts of the United Kingdom because we were the partner that the regions needed in terms of funding and support in that period. So right now we have the plan, and Victoria should adapt it. She should have it. She can have it for free. Cancel the non-dom status. Double the number. Use the money, the £3 billion, for doubling the number of training places for doctors and midwives and nurses, so that we can get the biggest increase in our health service staffing in its history. It's there for you. You've stolen the windfall tax. So you can have this one on a plate for you. It's there, waiting.
So I hope that Peter welcomes the, as I say, 35,000 more doctors, the 47,000 more nurses, the record number of people who are training to become doctors in the NHS. These are all really significant increases for the NHS. But coming into 2024-25, we will have record levels of spending in the NHS. What's important is how that money is spent. And with innovations such as community discharge centres, but also important community diagnostic centres, that's important, but also actually things such as the discharge fund, which is going to help those 13,000 people who are currently in hospital, who are waiting to get into care homes, get them into good care so that we can have those beds for people.
Right, I suppose what people will be asking is the difference, the contrast between Labour and the Conservatives, the government and opposition, in terms of whether or not the NHS has been adequately funded since 2010, which is when the Conservatives came into power. You're talking about now. Peter, you've offered this non-dom policy status for free to Victoria Atkins, which would raise £3.2 billion, I think, by Labour's own calculations, out of an NHS England budget of £153 billion a year. It's not going to solve the problems, is it?
We're going to have to decide on the overall funding at the point of taking office. Should we take office? There are some really tough decisions we're going to have to make because, of course, we've had 3 prime ministers in the last year, 4 chancellors, 4 budgets, and we've had the mini budget that blew a hole in the finances and created another £75 billion black hole in our public finances and in our economy. So we don't know what's going to happen in the next year and perhaps even the year after that, before the general election. So we are coming up with fully funded ideas that tackle the root cause of the root challenges. And right now, we have a staffing crisis because of the mismanagement, the failure. Jeremy Hunt cancelled the training programmes for nurses and doctors. He lowered the limits upon which we could train people and then get people into it. So the pipeline into our health service has been diminished. Plus, Brexit has caused other challenges too. And now we've had the pandemic, and we've had another few years of Tory mismanagement. So all of these things are there, so that we have fully funded programmes and policies that will tackle the root causes. That's the key thing.
Do you think funding is the key thing, though? Do you think it is just about money? Because there is one argument, isn't there, that trusts, obviously, performance varies massively. It's pretty patchy. Some trusts, with a similar amount of funding, are doing far better than others. Do you think that money is the only answer?
I think I've just said, coming up with the right policies, implementing it and having competence at the top right through to the front line is incredibly important.
Is that more targets?
Well, we've just stopped and paused inspections of hospitals because we think it would place too much additional bureaucracy on hospitals. So even the inspection regime is going to be paused for a period in the middle of a crisis. So, the whole system is grinding to a halt. The front door to the health service is broken. The system right the way behind it is. This isn't because of one-off flu. The winter flu crisis and the winter crisis in the NHS was ended under the last Labour government, with the last Labour government. The winter crisis now starts in August in this country. It is now a year-long crisis.
Well, let's. Do you think, and can you say hand on heart, Victoria, that the Conservatives have adequately funded the NHS since 2010?
Yes, within the very difficult circumstances we inherited from the Labour government. We remember that, we had that infamous note in the Treasury, you've run out of money. We had to deal with that. That meant very, very difficult decisions. But in fairness to the Prime Minister at the time, the NHS was protected. We made that a #1 pledge of the campaign, and the public trusted us with that. And we're now looking forward, having done all that hard work, we're now in the position where we're going to be able to make record levels of investment in 2024-25. And what this means, as Vicky said, is how it's spent. That's what's so important. And some of the things that you're seeing coming through from the Health Department, as I say, with these new innovative ideas, it's about making sure that the system knits together properly so that we get the care we need for older people, the care that we need for people coming in on...
Well, you say it's been adequately funded, and I'll leave viewers to make up their own mind, but let's just show them annual health spending increases. Since Tony Blair, we can sort of leave behind John Major and Margaret Thatcher because they predated, but if we're talking about the last Labour governments and the most recent Conservative governments pre-Boris Johnson, you can see Tony Blair, it's the largest number, 5.9% in terms of annual health spending increases into the health service. And at the other end is David Cameron, Prime Minister from 2010 to 2016, with 1.2%. Yes, an increase, but look at the difference between 1.2% and nearly 6% by Tony Blair. So can you still say, I take your point about the circumstances, that the NHS was adequately funded in those years? Theresa May still below 2% at 1.7% until 2016.
Yes, because everything we do has to be underscored by fiscal responsibility. It's why, for example, in the autumn statement, in very difficult economic circumstances that we face at the moment, nonetheless, we found more money for the NHS because we want to invest in the NHS and in social care, £3.3 billion over the next year and the year after, this year and the next year. So we have to act fiscally responsibly, but we also want to...
Was the mini-budget fiscally responsible?
We also want to ensure that we're preparing for the future. And just on the subject of non-DOMs, I've been watching, as Financial Secretary of the Treasury, I watch this with great interest because this has been lined up as the answer to Labour's answer to the needs of the NHS. The truth is that non-DOMs raise £7.9 billion in income tax. They raise £6.6 billion in investment since 2012. And what is interesting is at the weekend, I think Wes Streeting himself said it's not going to fix the problem.
Well, on that,
it'll fix one of the substantial problems.
Well,
and Victoria doesn't mention the mini-budget when she talks about fiscal responsibility. This is not a fiscally responsible government. It does not run the economy with either fairness at its heart or either fiscal responsibility and financial responsibility at its heart. When Labour left office, national debt was £800 billion. It was 1.8 trillion going into COVID. It is now 2.3 trillion. So the idea that the Labour Party left us with too much debt is absolutely for the birds.
Well,
you have borrowed for tax cuts and you have not invested in our public services and you have mismanagement through reforms of the NHS, which have cost billions of pounds but delivered nothing. The Lansley reforms cost £8 billion to implement.
During the coalition time. Well, let Victoria respond.
No outcomes for patients.
But, Peter, you remember the conversations about furlough. You know how expensive that was, and the support was right. I seem to remember it was supported by Labour.
Indeed.
And again, this is part of the hangover of the COVID pandemic.
1.8 trillion of debt going into COVID, 2.3 now.
We had to make that investment in order to support the businesses, the jobs and the wealth that we have managed to protect over the pandemic.
Pre-furlough.
All right, well, hang on. Let me just go back to the annual health spending increases. You say it is about money and funding.
No, I'm saying money is clearly important.
All right. Well, what would you... Well, let's, imagine, if we show everybody the faces of previous Prime Ministers, let's say Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister. What percentage health spending increase do you think should be under Keir Starmer if he were to win in 2024, if that's when the election is?
Well, I like the premise that he will be the next Prime Minister.
Well, I'm saying let's imagine.
But the key thing about Tony Blair and Gordon Brown was it was affordable.
Right.
It was affordable at that time.
All right.
We will be financially responsible.
Rachel Reeves has said this. You might not actually get up to those levels then.
Rachel Reeves has said that we will fully fund every single investment programme that we have. And that is really important. Now, and so that means that we will make sure we spend the right amount of money, but it will be in a fiscally responsible way.
So you could be more like Theresa May, right?
We need to decide what the needs are and what is possible at the time of taking office. I don't think anybody watching this would expect me to make a firm percentage guarantee.
But you see the point I'm making. What I'm saying on that spectrum, are you going to be closer to the sort of spending increases under David Cameron and Theresa May, or do you think Keir Starmer should be closer to Gordon Brown and Tony Blair?
We will do what is appropriate and responsible at the time of taking office.
But it was affordable
also,
because taxes were put up to fund it.
Well, now we have the highest, because of this government, we have the highest tax burden for 70 years since the Second World War.
So
and
you
we
don't
have to
want
make
to add
sure
to
we
that.
have to make sure that, as Rachel Reeves says, she will tax fairly and spend wisely. And we need to make sure that when we take office, we have a plan, a programme for managing the NHS, tackling the root causes of the challenges. Right now, that is a staffing crisis. We need to tackle the staffing crisis. We have a fully costed policy ready to go on that front. And we will make these decisions. But the key thing about Keir's speech last week was it was a 10-year programme for renewal for our country. We're not thinking, and we're not promising the country we can tackle and solve all of these problems in 1 year. We are talking about a 10-year programme for renewal. And when you look at those faces, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, it took 10 years to get to the point where you had a maximum wait of 2 days to see a GP, you had a maximum 18 weeks for treatment. Now most people are waiting more than 2 years for treatment and 4 weeks for a GP's appointment.
I mean, this is where the debate is obviously going to be this year. Labour, Keir Starmer has decided that this is a very, very weak area for the government. The argument being, you know, were there already big structural problems within the NHS? Was there significant underfunding? And can the government blame COVID for the majority of it in the way that Victoria Atkins has tried to set out?
Well, I mean, it's a bit of each probably, isn't it? It always is. But I think there will, of course, be people who totally accept that the pandemic put a massive pressure on the NHS. But there are problems such as social care, for example, which numerous governments have talked about. And yet again, people have stepped back from the reform. This government has stepped back from the reform, which some people think would massively help. So I suppose there's a big question for Labour. Would they pledge to do something about that? But yeah, there's clearly the NHS and the daily experiences of lots of people. And when it comes to the strikes, which I'm sure we'll talk about, lots of people will already say, well, look, actually getting an ambulance was already a major issue even before the strikes came on the scene. So, you know, I think anyone will look at this and know, because it affects so many millions of people every month, that it's a headache for the government and ministers. And I'm not sure anyone seems to have a solution at the moment.
Well, Vicky, you've brought up the issue around the minimum service legislation. Rishi Sunak certainly referred to Keir Starmer and Labour not backing the government's introduction of this legislation. Let's find out exactly what it entails. Peter Barnes has been listening and watching. Peter, what does it mean, this minimum safety, I think the government calls it, legislation that's been introduced?
Yeah, they do sometimes use the phrase minimum safety rather than minimum services, but the bill itself is actually called the Strikes Minimum Service Levels Bill. And the way it's going to work, it's fairly complicated. There's quite a lot of stages to it. If this bill gets passed and becomes a law, then it wouldn't set minimum service levels in public services immediately, but it gives the government the powers to come up with minimum service levels. So the government ministers would decide what they thought was the minimum service required in health or transport or education and a number of other services. And then they'd ask Parliament to agree those minimum service levels. Now, once that's happened, if there's a strike, the employers in those services would be able to say to the unions and to striking workers, we think to meet the minimum service levels that Parliament has agreed, we need these people to come to work even on a strike day. So there would have to be a certain number of people going into work in those public services, even if in general there was a strike. Now, as we've seen with some of the recent strikes, there have in some cases been voluntary agreements to allow a minimum service level, but it hasn't been nationally agreed and it hasn't covered all the strikes. The government wants to have this new power. Now, in those circumstances, where the employer has set out what's called a work notice, saying who's got to come in on strike days, there is a chance that if the union doesn't comply, the union could be sued. And if the individual workers don't turn up to work when they've been named by the employer, they could be at risk of being dismissed.
Peter Barnes from the Political Research Unit at the BBC. Thank you very much. What's wrong with that?
Because you see both sides moving to a more extreme position. You've got the government saying they're going to legislate to force people back to work, and you've got the unions now talking about coordinated action. We should never be in this position. And actually, when you look to how you get better industrial actions, you look to the points in the past where you have a government that is proactive and is constantly engaging with the unions, never shutting them out the door, and actually working really closely with them. Now the government wants to sort of look to other countries. I presume that Victoria in a second is going to say, well, France has a minimum service guarantee.
It's actually quite patchy. We looked into some of the legislation in other countries like France. It isn't quite as simple as perhaps was made
Can I
out.
make this point, though? Because if you look at industrial action in the past, if you look between 2010 and 2019, in Britain, per 1,000 workers, we had 17 days of industrial action. In France, it was 172. Now, the government says, with all of this on the table, I think we need to be a bit more like France when it comes to industrial action. What we say is get to the point where actually you're working in tandem with all parts of industry to make sure you have a smooth-running economy and you have a workforce which is remunerated properly for the work that it does.
Victoria?
Well, I do think, and Peter, I know, behaves honourably, but I do think in all these conversations, Labour MPs should declare the donations they have received from their trade union paymasters before they enter into this discussion. So I know Peter's, because I've looked them up, properly declared.
Right.
But
on the actual principle, all right, that's
puts
clear.
It into context, because when a Labour MP stands up and says ex-union, is doing the right thing, and how dare the government question about minimum safety levels. I do think it's important for us all to understand the background.
Is anything I just said was unreasonable when I talked about the unions? You think I was talking about the government because the unions have paid me to do so?
Because
is that what you're accusing me of?
What I think, Peter, is that it's important context, because when you talk about government speaking and negotiating with the trade unions, we do so with patients first and foremost in our sights. The minimum safety levels
look at the outcomes that are being delivered.
The minimum safety levels are about ensuring that just as the Royal College of Nurses has agreed a national framework during their strike action to help the most urgent cases, sadly, we haven't been able to get that with the ambulance services, for example. So we want our constituents to be able to get that incredibly important care when they need it on the days that strikes are happening. The reason we're using international comparators is to make the point that, look, other signatories to the International Labour Organisation and Convention also have minimum safety levels. I appreciate there may be nuances and so on. But we do now, with this strike action, we do need to be able to ensure our patients can get to hospital, can get to work. And
You're a minister in the Treasury, and we reported this week that a one-off payment could actually help solve the crisis, particularly in parts of the health service. Has the Treasury blocked a one-off payment of around £1,000 or any one-off payment to nurses to deal with the pay settlement this year?
No, we don't recognise these reports.
You don't recognise them?
So at the moment, departments are meeting, ministers are meeting in the relevant departments with the trade unions. Those talks are ongoing. I'm not involved in them from my perspective. I look after the tax side of things. But those talks are ongoing. We want them to continue. We want, everybody has entered them in.
Have they been ruled out, one-off payments?
I can't comment because I'm not involved in them, and it's really important, I think, that those conversations can happen, in a frank way, behind closed doors, so that people can understand the needs.
Looking at the idea for several weeks, hasn't it?
Well, again, I'm not involved.
What kind of things would the Treasury be weighing up?
What we want to do is within the really important context of the independent pay review boards. And I know Labour, not Peter necessarily, but Labour is very dismissive of these independent pay review boards. They're really important. I as Prisons Minister last year, led the government.
But that's what's led to the strikes in the main thing, if you're not going to talk about pay this year for the settlement 22-23.
But the independent pay review boards, they've been around for decades. They have people of the most enormous expertise and integrity, experts in labour market analysis, experts in the economy, trade union representatives as well. Helping, looking at all the evidence that we put forward, and then we as a government are bound by those recommendations unless there are. And this
you're not actually bound. You can recommend, you can overrule, and so on. Just to be clear for our viewers, that's not completely the case.
With very exceptional situations.
Well, people might say this is an exceptional case, particularly with the widespread strikes. I'm going to just stop.
We accepted the recommendations last year of the NHS.
I'm just going to, because we mentioned Andrew. I just want to get to Andrew Bridgen, the Conservative MP who has lost the whip for comments that he's made about the vaccine programme. Misinformation, it's been called by the Chief Whip. But he's been making these comments since October. Why has it taken the government so long?
I mean, the circumstance of the PM obviously dealt with the latest set of circumstances, and we're being very careful about the way they're described this morning in PMQs. I think the Chief Whip was absolutely right to remove the whip.
Right. For those reasons. But why wasn't the whip removed when he started making these comments that are misinformation according to
I am not involved in the whipping, but what I would say is that I think the comments he is alleged to have made overnight are of such a nature that I'm pleased that the Chief Whip has intervened so quickly.
That's all we have time for from all of us. Bye-bye.